understaffed. Fair. But you can't say, it is not acceptable to say that you have a system in place with people functioning in the system and an infrastructure that encloses the people in the system, and you're not aware of systemic vulnerabilities. You have to be. That's the whole point. That's what intelligence is. That's at least one branch of intelligence, sort of defensive posturing, as I said before, right? Defensively speaking, you have to put yourself in a position, in a posture, that you recognize inherent systemic, infrastructural, individual vulnerabilities and safeguard as best as you can from external threat. That external threat is a threat because there is the intent to harm. Since there is, and I'm definitely going sort of fast and deeper, but I think you guys can follow along. Since there is an intent to harm, and intentionality is a construct of the human mind, well, guess what? I got a mind just like you, and believe you're not smarter than me. I'm going to figure this out. You plan on doing that? Let me see. How would I approach it if I were you? How would I try to destroy this if I were you? That's the idea, right? So that you have to assume sort of a systemically destructive conceptual framework in order to secure. You can't properly talk about security options if you aren't thinking about systemic vulnerabilities, period. End of discussion, right? So that's that. Okay. And there's more things that we can talk about, but the demarcation in terms of intent is what's absolutely critical at this point. All right, I'm probably going to do, how much time do I have? Probably going to do, hopefully get to threats on the next page, but we'll see how much time I have. All right, so to continue, then, having defined sort of knowledge and power, and obviously here, the power that I was specifically, and I probably should have made this a little bit more explicit, is power, at least one manifestation of it, in terms of a more sound defensive posturing, right? The idea is, of course, intelligence can be used as an offensive or a guide, a plan, a strategy for offensive posturing, but right now, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. All right, so a formalized distinction between risks and threats then, right? Distinction between risks and threats. Alright, distinctions between risks and threats. Risks represent the unintended harmful consequences of otherwise beneficial human activities, right? There's emphasis in the original, right? Unintended was emphasized in the original text. So risks represent unintended harmful consequences. Okay, so when we're talking about risks then, we're talking about unintended harmful, H-A-R-M. The only caveat I would put is potentially harmful, right? That's the only caveat. The reason being is if it's harmed, if it's inflicted harm, it could potentially sort of morph into a threat if someone wants to capitalize on the vulnerability of a risk. But that's a little too advanced for this sort of introductory level. So that the idea is, just sort of regularly, risks represent unintended harmful consequences, but the idea is, yes, there either is the potential for harm, or someone was in fact harmed, but it was accident, or it is inherent in the structure of the system that this potential for harm is possible. So that's the first bit. Next, the process, this is number one, the process of any and all systems lend themselves to risk. That's what I've been saying, right? The process of any and all systems lend themselves to risk, right? That's probably going to find its way into the final publication, I would imagine, right? The process of any and, well, maybe not, because, it's public, so I basically start from scratch, but I'm going to highlight that line, right? The process of any and all systems lend themselves to risk. If you construct a system, your system is vulnerable, period, and you should know that. And we're not just talking about systems that have direct sort of physical applicability. We're not talking about necessarily systems in the world in terms of engineering systems. We're also talking about systems, conceptually speaking, in terms of ideological relationships, ideological dogma, we're talking about theoretical coherence, theoretical consistency. Those are also systems. These systems, be they infrastructural, engineering-based in the world, or conceptual, theoretical in the mind, are equally subject to systemic vulnerability. Hence, there is a certain risk involved. For people like me who tinker, I look for, theoretically, the weaknesses in individual conceptual systems and try to destabilize those systems that I feel are antithetical to my interests as an academic, to, national security interests and such, right? Because those theoretical systems inform physical systems to some degree, right? So the idea is there's a two-pronged approach that's needed to really talk about intelligence security. One prong is minimizing and risk mitigation in terms of physical risk mitigation. I would say 99.99999% of the discourse on security is that, and many, many variations of that. I'm now telling the world, and I'm making it public, because this is the type of stuff that I do, new stuff, that theoreticians coming into the field, first come into the field because you can probably write the seminal text, you can help defend your countries, and you can make extremely meaningful contributions for the little bit of time that we got before we turn to maggot food. But the idea is we can also build systems to protect, and we can use our mind to destabilize and destroy other systems, right? And this stuff works. This stuff works. So all systems are themselves at risk to some degree, and this is the idea of structural. I can't believe I actually heard it. This is sort of the idea of structural violence. I'm not going to get into structural violence here. Absolutely genius prospect, absolutely genius discourse. Johan Galtung talks about the relationship of structural violence, and it is the risk that these systems pose of whatever kind, pose to humanity to varying degrees. If you want to get more on that, just Google structural violence and you can read it, whatever sort of pops up. So the emphasis, however, rests in the notion of intentionality, right? It's about intentionality. It is about the specific willful intent to harm, in whole or in part, blah, 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 right? It is intended, there's an intent to harm. And insofar as there is an intent to harm, you sort of do detective work from the intent and try and infer how that might manifest, or if it has already manifested, you deductively try to make sense of what the potential motivations for that harm were. But obviously then we're doing more threat assessment, threat analysis, and not risk assessment. Risk analysis. Risk assessment and risk analysis, as far as I'm concerned, and there's a ton of people who write and have published in this field, so there's going to invariably be disagreements on sort of what position you take, how you define risk and such. I'm not going to get into all of that now. And I'm really not interested in the sort of the definitional debate on this particular concept, risk and threat. But the idea is, insofar as we talk about risk, risk is systemic. It's a systemic concern, so that there is inherent risk within any system. Insofar as we talk about threat, it's not that it's not systemic. It is systemic, and it is concerned with sort of system dynamics and an understanding of it to varying degrees, but it really is rooted in an understanding of willful individual or collective group intentionality. That's what it's about. And that discourse is a much, 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 much harder discourse than a discourse of, okay, what aspect of this fulcrum could potentially be destabilized or weakened? How could this thing collapse? How could we bribe this person and get them to compromise their allegiance and blah, 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 blah. There's been a lot done in that, and all of it has been very meaningful. But national security is more than just that, because the nation in national security isn't something that is empirically verifiable. The nation exists as a concept, and to secure the nation, to secure the ideological governance which defines and motivates the actions of the nation, means that you need a different toolkit. It's part of national intelligence, it's part of security, but it's not going to be sort of this traditional discourse of security. And I know I hope I'm not just being redundant and saying this over and over, but it's, for me, it's